Welcome to a very special edition of JTV where we're going to be discussing Christian Zionism, which is a very, very intriguing topic to me and to the Jewish community and frankly to most thinking people. I want to start off by just saying a big thank you to both of you, Jonathan Farrell and Jacob Vince. Jonathan Farrell, you are the Director of Student Affairs at StandWithUs. And Jacob Vince, you are the Chief Executive of Christian Friends of Israel. Is that just in the UK?
I'm just a Chief Executive in the UK itself.
In the UK,
but there are other offices around the world.
Right. And both of your organisations have very kindly sponsored this interview, and we're really excited to grapple with some of the issues surrounding Christian Zionism. So the first thing I want to do is just understand how each of you got into the positions that you're in now, because it's not, frankly, the most common of positions or ideologies to have. So Jacob, do you want to start with you? How did you get into Christian Zionism?
Well, I had an opportunity as a teenager to spend time on a kibbutz. It was the sort of thing that was done at the time. So I actually was on a kibbutz in 79-80 in northern Israel.
Wow.
So that was my first introduction to Israel as such. And then later, actually a bit earlier than that, our church minister was stuck out in Israel during the Yom Kippur War. He was stuck in a very nice location, which was the American Colony Hotel, but it was the 73 Yom Kippur War. So he ended up writing a book about his experience, and I think I did read that as a sort of in my late teens before I actually found myself going out to Israel.
And that's what got you interested in...
Well, I suppose...
Were you a practicing Christian already?
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
Yes, no, I was, yeah. But you know, you're young, you don't. And then later on, I did have an opportunity. Our church minister moved out to Israel, so I was then I assisted him out there in Jerusalem for a year and a half.
Did you experience any opposition amongst your Christian peers for positions?
Not really, because we were a fairly independent sort of church, so that would have come later.
Right.
And then life takes over. Have a family. And I get quite involved with the Church of England. Okay. So at the time when I took on my present role, I was a member of the General Synod of the Church of England, and I think I just became a church commissioner as well. So then trying to put these two dynamics together has been quite interesting, and that's what I've been doing. And eventually this role came up. My background as a chartered surveyor and perhaps midlife crisis, not sure, but I was approached for the role. I was doing a course with Christian Friends of Israel at the time called the Kesher course, and heard about it. I thought, and one thing leads to another. So I've been doing this now for about 8 years.
Wow. And Jonathan, what about you? What's your Christian Zionist story?
My Christian Zionist story. So I grew up in a Christian family. But Israel wasn't a major feature of that in church or exactly. And I grew up in Aylesbury, and I did a little wiki search, and there was about less than 2% of the population identify as Jewish. There was more people who self-identified as Jedis than there were Jewish people in Aylesbury. So that's to give you a picture of sort of the background. I was kind of... My first encounter with Christian Zionism was actually with Christian Friends of Israel UK. As a Christian, went to numerous kind of Christian youth conferences, and there was one called Momentum where I went back in 2013. And Christian Friends of Israel UK had a stall there. And I just applied to go to university to study international relations in Arabic. And I had an interest in the Middle East. The Arab Spring had happened. I was just interested to find out more. But Israel wasn't the center of that at all. And so I engaged with the Christian Friends of Israel at Momentum and bought all these books, was very keen, very enthusiastic. But it wasn't until I got to university that I encountered students who were setting up an Israel Society on campus, all non-Jews. And I had a very basic underlying assumption that, well, Jesus was Jewish, so of course I'm pro-Israel. That was the kind of limit of my Zionism or my expression at that time. Right. So I got involved in the Friends of Israel Society and kind of helped set that up. But then very quickly, as I got more involved, I started hearing from professors things like the historical connection of the Jews to the land is fake, it's made up. I had one professor who was a history professor say he's been to Israel himself and he's seen that the state has fabricated all of the evidence of Jewish connection to Jerusalem and the land of Israel.
Yeah.
And I thought, if that's true, then there's no historical basis for Christianity or my faith. And that's when I first began to think really of myself as a Christian in relation to Israel and the misinformation that I was hearing. So I got more involved in that way. So my concern really began from an educational perspective, from a sense of finding solidarity with the Jewish students on campus when it came to misinformation about Israel and how that impacted on their story and ultimately also the Christian story. And it wasn't until many years after that that I began to think of my relationship with Christian Zionism in any vaguely theological sense. So I began really from my time at university, and that's been a journey that I've been on ever since.
Oh, really interesting stories. Jacob, let's sort of zoom out for a second. Why do you think there's been, unfortunately, up until recently, a history of anti-Semitism within Christianity, or at least some parts and some moments in the history of Christianity? And what do you think is sort of a true reading of the New Testament with regard to how Jews should be perceived? I know there's a lot in that.
There's a lot in there. Okay. Obviously, we're looking at it back, over a period of 2,000 years now. And in what is referred to as the New Testament, unfortunately, I don't think it's the best term, but I might come to that if we get a moment.
Okay.
And I don't think it's the term that the early church would have used either. But the nature of a message that's coming out from Israel to the nations means Israel's very small, the nations are numerous, so proportionately it's always going to be a very small part, physically and visually. However, it's a very big part in terms of the written record that we have, because it was all written within the context, a Jewish context, and the writers were all actually Jewish, even potentially one who might not have been Jewish, who was an assistant to one of what we would call apostles, like emissaries, I think. So there is that embedded link, but very quickly you start to move away from it in proportions of numbers, because there's far more Gentiles than there are Jews. There was one instance in the Bible, or in the part that is referred to in the New Testament, as Paul was writing to the church at Rome, where you might know in the history the Jews had been exiled and were returning, and at that point the church had become virtually Gentile. So he was writing to them how they should be responding to Jews wanting to come, be part again of that fold. And the two things that essentially are said, and I believe the whole letter to the Roman church is about this subject, was not to be ignorant and not to be arrogant. And unfortunately, that's the reason over the centuries, because it's come from ignorance and arrogance, and they both feed off each other. And because it was so dominant, it's very easy to be arrogant because you're such a large grouping, things were growing. But and also perhaps trying to have some separate identity from Jewish people that were continuing practicing in a different way. So that may have something to do with it. Yeah.
Do you think when it was said, some anti-Semites would say, we don't like Jews because they killed Jesus? Do you think that's an excuse, or do you think?
I think it's actually a complete misreading of what the written record is. I think you have to go back to the written record, and it just doesn't say that.
Right.
If you look at it very, very carefully, and obviously with my work over the last 8 years, but before that some as well, it's just complete misreading, and you're reading things into the text that are simply not there. In saying that, and I'm talking now about the biblical canon of Scripture in the same way the Jewish would have their, their Tanakh. So in terms of biblical canon, and not the extra writings, the writings that actually made it in the canon, I don't believe would say that. You could misread them to say that, but you can do that with anything. If you look at the whole picture and how it's written and the concern, but some other writings which didn't make it in, which were later or in pseudonyms written by other people. Actually, some of those are shockingly anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
There was a view quite early on by he was condemned as a heretic called Marcion, who suggested that the God of the New Testament was superior to the God of the Old Testament. In fact, a different God even. That was actually, he was condemned as a heretic by Tertullian, who was one of the early church fathers, but some of his designations did stick. So the actual designation of Old Testament, New Testament were his.
I want to stay a little bit more with you on the history of Christian Jewish relations, and then we'll move to more contemporary issues with you, Jonathan.
Yeah.
I think now we live in really unprecedented time in terms of Christian Jewish relations in general. I'm not saying across the board, but in general.
Yeah.
How and when did things change, in your view?
Well, I suppose we're talking at it from the Western viewpoint.
Yes.
When the church became much more institutionalized, Constantine, that sort of period, and then there was a Council of Nicaea, Constantinople as well, a bit after that. That I think was when a real separation, occurred more fully. I think the Jewishness of the church was maintained for quite a long, century, maybe century and a half, a bit more. That was still there, but at that point there was a really a strong cut-off point. And what happened was that the established church, became the authority over the written text, and it was translated Latin. So it started to be the preserve of the elite, and corruption sets in. I think Lord Annan said, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, and I think he said it actually of the papacy when they were considering the infallibility of the Pope, which he disagreed with. So when it started to change, I think, in this country and actually in Europe itself, was when the text became available in the language of the common people. Then the people could read it, just like the Jewish people have always been able to read, and then it's question for question. You don't accept just what's being told you. You can actually say, well, is this correct? And that's how students and pupils and the teachers learn. Both the teacher is held to account and the student holds them to account, but also learns from them. And I think during that period, once, so it was like 450 years ago, we had the authorized version, I think it's about 410 years ago, in our own language. People could read it for themselves.
Right.
And then they start to read it and say, well, some of the things they're saying don't square up with what's in the scripture.
Yeah, and you start to get Enlightenment thinkers and the founding fathers of America who were, very respectful of the Jewish people. And
totally.
I
think the other, well, I won't go into any more on that, but within 50 years, there was at that stage, the Jewish people had been exiled from this country, 1290
Right.
by Edward the First. So, but at that stage, there was a petition coming across from Holland in 1648 to suggest that the Jews should come back to this country, but also that the English nation of England and the Netherlands should be the first to transport Israel's sons and daughters to the land promised to their forefathers, Abraham, Isaac and Jacob.
So this
was a petition that came through around about, you got Charles I, Cromwell at that point, and then Charles II.
Yeah. So this touches on my next question, which is, when did Christian Zionism become a thing?
It's always difficult because probably throughout the centuries there's always been an element of that, but at that stage, certainly that's pretty good evidence that there were people that were already thinking that actually why the Jewish people, that's part of their calling almost to have a land that was given and promised. I mean, the promises, when you start reading the whole script, our whole scripture, if I can use it, the Jewish part and the later quarter, there's so much about the land. I mean, 100%. The promise made to Abraham was a country and a child.
Yes. Yeah.
So how else can you interpret that?
Jonathan,
to be a blessing to others,
right?
That sort of blessing of difference actually should be that way rather than the other way. It wasn't ever exclusive for their benefit, but it was distinctive for everyone.
Right, Jonathan. Does this kind of thinking influence your Christian Zionism?
Yeah, I think what Jacob said about the development of Christianity and understanding that there was a point where there was a separation from the Jewish context of our faith. And I think what's been very influential for me is learning where the real stark differences that are assumed quite widely within the evangelical world about the difference between Christianity and Judaism. Obviously, the major differences being obvious, but things like the distinction between the New and the Old Testament, and what that framework does for allowing maybe an arrogance to set in within historical Christianity that says our testament or our portion of Scripture is new and is completely gotten rid of the old, and false ideas, perhaps through that have contributed to historical anti-Semitism within the church, a kind of superiority, and I think that touches on what Jacob says about the arrogance and the ignorance. So kind of learning about that has been hugely influential to me. I think at the core of my story and where I would say that the major influence came from me earlier on was simply taking the Bible by what it says, and being encouraged from a very young age not to think, not to have a different, not to view one testament as better than the other, and just taking as historical fact the things that the Bible says. And that means taking for a fact the things about the life and story of the Jewish people. When I went to campus, I said that when somebody asked me, why are you pro-Israel? I would say, well, Jesus was Jewish. But on top of that, I would say, well, I understand from the scriptures that when we refer to Israel, we're not just referring to a state, we're referring to a people, because it was a people first and foremost, and that they had a national origins deeply connected to a specific land. And we can't just ignore that side of history, and that is biblical history. And there's archaeology and numerous evidence to testify to that. And I think those historical truths are biblical truths, and if you don't accept those as fact, then you have a problem about what you do with the rest of your Christianity, because Christianity only came along far later in the story, as it were.
So a question for both of you would be, what would you say to a Christian that might say to you, and this is theoretical, I don't know if they would say this, but if they said, well, we understand that God had a need for a Jewish people, but since the time of Jesus, there's no function for the Jewish people anymore, and therefore we don't need to be Zionists because there's no need for this. Now everyone just needs to simply follow the path of Jesus, and there's no role for the Jewish people. What would either of you say to that?
Well, I look at the basis of God being a covenant-making and a covenant-keeping God. And we start with one of the early covenants that he made with Noah, that while the earth remains, seed time and harvest won't fail, and cold and heat and summer and winter won't cease. So he made this promise to Noah. He didn't make it for a particular grouping of people, he made it for the whole earth, and we're all benefiting from it now. So are we saying that covenant is no longer valid? Of course not, right, because we're all benefiting from it. Then if he's made other covenants, which he has clearly with Abraham, a covenant of a child and a country, why shouldn't that still be valid? Actually, they're stepping stones, they're steps along the journey. Then there's the covenant with Moses, covenant of the commandments, the covenant with David, the covenant will be a crown. And so we see that as should really see as a succession for then as we come into the story, as it were, as Gentiles, although there were always Gentiles through the early parts of the scriptures as well, huge, important ones too. And then we have the covenant, as I would call it, the cup of the new covenant. So all of those covenants are part of the story. You can't ignore them. So they're not old. They're just but they build the picture.
So what is the function of the Jewish people from your perspective? And do you as a Christian see the 613 laws of the Torah as still binding to the Jewish people?
Well, that's an interesting story, and that would be. But I'd like to answer the first question first, if I may.
Go for it. Yeah.
A professor of systematic theology at Wesleyan Theological Seminary in Washington DC has written a book called "The God of Israel and Christian Theology," and he looks at the history of the church and pinpoints 3 different areas of what would be called supersessionism. That's, in other words, the church taking over the place of Israel. The first one is structural, and I think this is quite strong. Basically, the way that the church view it, because they're reading back from where they are back through, they see the creation in Genesis 1 and 2, they see the fall in Genesis 3, and then they suddenly jump to the beginning of what would be termed the New Testament, Matthew, and then that's the redemption.
Right.
And all the rest you don't even need there, and that's called structural supersessionism. The next one he refers to is what was called economic supersessionism, and that is the one you're referring to. In other words, Israel exists until they launch the final part of the rocket, which would be, the New Testament, Jesus, and so on, and then falls away. And so that's the form which quite a lot of people might take, as you're suggesting. The final one is, but what happens to the Jews when they're still around?
Right.
Well, they're then being shown as an example of what happens if you reject. The fact that Gentiles reject, probably in proportion just as many as Jews, is neither here nor there. And then you start to think, well, it's a bit of an irritation. They're really there just to sort of wonder and show what goes wrong. And that's would be punitive supersessionism. Right. That's where you start to go in the wrong direction. And then he starts to correct it and in his book. So there will be those that hold that view. Again, I would go back to God being covenant making and covenant keeping God. He is faithful. If he's not going to be faithful to the Jewish people, they didn't choose him, we didn't choose God, even as Christians, he's chosen us, then why should he still be faithful to us?
Right.
If he's not faithful to the Jewish people?
Yeah.
In measure, it may not be the full story, but the problem with the church is that largely we've got the last quarter and miss out the first 3 quarters, whereas might be able to suggest that the Jewish people have the first 3 quarters and miss out the last quarter. But both, when you understand a bit better how they integrate, I think it's more helpful. And by and large, those that have understood the Old Testament, as Christians would call it, better, have largely been less anti-Semitic than those that have relied on the final quarter.
So, Jonathan, is there anything you want to pick up on what's just been said in this regard?
Yeah, I think I agree with much of what Jacob said. I think it's interesting to note when we talk about where certain views of Christians have come from, that why there's such a difference in interpretation. And I think it comes down to looking at in our churches and is our experience as a Christian. This was my experience growing up. The Old Testament wasn't talked about or preached in a systematic way nearly to the same extent that the New Testament was. And this gave a cultural sense as a Christian growing up in the UK that it was somehow irrelevant. And that might have not been intended, and that might not be the meaning, but it would sort of lend a kind of suspicion to reading the Old Testament, which again is disproportionately the majority of our scriptures, but lent itself to that view. And I think there's a huge argument to be made about what that has done for influencing the thinking of young people and young Christians in how they then look at the Old Testament. Because as Jacob says, you might go through Genesis 1 to 3, you get to the fall, and then you go immediately to the biography of Jesus. And therefore, because you're so confused by these prophetic texts and talks of drought and punishment, and it makes it seem as if God is very different in the Old and in the New, when that's not the case. It's not 2 different gods, but that kind of culture lends itself to that view. Just one last thing is when people say, about the accusation the Jews killed Jesus and all of that. I think a simple reading of what Jesus Christ himself and what the New Testament text says supports the claim very explicitly that God doesn't change his mind, or God doesn't change fundamentally between old and new. He doesn't abide by the distinctions that we've created in history. and for the accusation particularly that Jesus was killed by Jews. The New Testament text, Jesus says of himself, "No one takes my life from me, I lay it down of my own accord." Jesus Christ says of himself that there is no agency that can be justified to say this people or that people killed Jesus exclusively and therefore justify hatred against them on that basis. But those assumptions come because they read the New Testament and only understand that and don't understand the Old Testament, and therefore tempted to essentially replace the Jewish people without even realizing that they're doing it. And that's probably the more polite ignorance coming through, but it has tragic consequences, and history testifies to that.
Question to both of you. Who are the biggest opponents within Christianity towards Christian Zionism, if there are? I'm sure you have experience of that.
Yes, within Christianity. It's a strange mix because there's some from the more liberal end and there's some from the more evangelical end. And although they make strange bedfellows, they do find themselves sometimes in the same camp, which is bizarre because they wouldn't be seen in the same camp on many other subjects. Some of it will come from a misunderstanding of social justice. It would be coming from the group that might have been involved in South Africa and apartheid and doing that type of things. And they had all the skills all set up, apartheid's finished, how much credit they would or wouldn't or should really take for that is another thing. So, and then they start to move on to, well, what else looks like that in the world? And superficially, they could go that way. I think also Israel did not have many friends. They did work early on with where they could get support, and there was some support from white South Africa. So it's an easy transition. And then it becomes slightly folklorish. It's, so that's from the more largely liberal end, but not entirely. There were some popular singers that might write about this. Social justice is a big thing anyway. So if you can find a campaign that's relatively safe, it's in a world you can understand because Israel have only got democracy as opposed to many of the other nations in that region. And then you start the momentum keeps going. And so they need the cause as much as the cause needs them. So that's from the liberal end. From the evangelical end, I think there were different perspectives of support for Israel. Dual covenant would be one which they would be against, for sure. The second one would be possibly what's sometimes referred to as dispensational. That's more complex. But basically, the end times, the end of the world situation, this is going to happen. There will be a mass taking away, sometimes referred to as the rapture of the faithful Christians, and part of that picture means that the Jews are re-established. But so the more conservative of the evangelical world, and that tends to move into the more charismatic, more Pentecostal approach. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong in that sense, but then the evangelical, conservative evangelical would row back from that and say, we don't think that's how you should interpret the Bible. So therefore, and then they would tar everything with the same brush. So looking at the end times things, they say, well, that's clearly wrong. So therefore, Christian Zionism is wrong. Therefore, we have to campaign against it. Right. And then they suddenly get a bit of support from some social justice young Christians, and that. So from both angles, that's what's happening.
Yeah. Jonathan?
Yeah, I think there's an interesting thing when we talk about where Christianity became accessible to the lay person was with the Reformation and the translation of the Bible into English. And there's a deep irony in the term Reformation because there were many doctrines and many things about Christian practice that were reformed. And I think most evangelicals would be very grateful for the Reformation and what it accomplished in terms of a reformation of theology from being synonymous with institutional power and so on. But there are also things that were not reformed, and a lot of that has been a continuation of these false ideas that were introduced by people like Origen and others, and often that was related to the Jewish people, and that often comes down to Israel. The church has replaced Israel. The true Israel is the church, not the Jewish people, even though the phrase true Israel doesn't appear kind of in the original texts. And that has had a great influence on modern day evangelical thinking. And there's a particular movement within Christian circles that is kind of up and coming in the sense that with our kind of globalized world that we're in and the kind of a longing for meaning that people have, a sort of reaction against the liberal side of theology. A lot of young people, and I've experienced this in my own life, being drawn to groups and ministers that are very active online, that kind of take pride in themselves as being culturally distinct and conservative, but also being relevant in the modern era. And when it comes to Israel, there's still sort of a very hidden opposition that comes through in its theology, which is a hangover from the Reformation and the teaching there. But because Reformation teaching is so celebrated for the majority of what it's accomplished, it's hard to decouple those aspects where it perhaps wasn't reformed in line with its view of Israel and the Jews. And so when you try and introduce the conversation about Israel in these circles, there is this assumption that you come from a dual covenant background or a Christian Zionist perspective, which these conservative-minded evangelicals would directly oppose. And it's sort of lumping you into one area of Christian Zionism, which might not be true of who you are, but because Christian Zionism has been given a bad name and dispensationalism has been interpreted in a certain way in history, modern evangelicalism has positioned itself as a reaction to that. And you're accused of being that kind of Christian Zionist if you dare to even bring up the conversation of Israel in Bible studies or in the church. So there's little nuance there, and it's hard to be a Christian Zionist that doesn't fit into either camp. And that can be a challenge.
I'm deeply moved whenever I meet Christian Zionists. And I went last year. I went for the 100-year anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. I went to the Royal Albert Hall. Was this something you were involved with?
In that, yes.
You were involved with it, and it was organised by Christians. Was it Christians? Christians alone. That organised it. And it was honestly one of the most moving experiences of my life. Just seeing so much love in the room for the Jewish state and the Jewish people, and coming from your values, and
long overdue.
Sorry,
long overdue.
It was really it was deeply moving, and I recognise its historical significance. I have to say one of the things, because I'm as I say, really just impressed and inspired when I meet Christian Zionists. But one of the things that my fellow Jews will say to me when I discuss Christian Zionism, in fact, that's always the first thing they'll say is, you can probably guess it, well, they only support Israel because they want to hasten the second coming. And they think that will only happen when you have the majority of Jews in Israel. Good. Even if often say to that, even if that's the case, so what? Take the friends you can, but I don't know if that even is the case. So do you want to both deal with that?
There will be those that would take that view. I think whether it's biblical, whether historical, even on current affairs, I'd like to feel that a really properly thinking, engaging Christian would support Israel because it's the right thing to do. But not for any benefit and gain to come back to me or to hasten this. Whoever thinks they can hasten a second coming, it may be the case, but we don't know. We don't know timing. Everyone thinks everything's going to happen in their own lifetime. Well, who knows? We can't.
We're not God.
Absolutely. But some people are over prescriptive, and I think that's dangerous territory. I think there's enough other reasons to give support. And some will support, well, it says, if you bless me, I'll be blessed. So they're actually doing it because they want to get blessed. Well, that may be the case, but that's not the reason either, because that's, you have to do what's the right thing to do.
Right.
And it's just simply the benefit of the heritage that we have is huge. And to, not be supportive is a strange place to be. But I think largely it's for ignorance. There's whole loads of factors that have obscured the whether it's the big picture story, whether it's the fact that when clergy go to study the subject, they generally choose one, or most of them will choose one language. They're going to choose Greek rather than Hebrew. Those that study Hebrew have a much better understanding of the Jewish aspects, and I have quite a lot to do with a whole number of clergy and so on in another capacity. But all these things are no. So yes, but I can see where that view would come. I could see how they would say that. Sometimes those that are most outspoken or most emotional about these things would be taking it in that view, but I think it's flawed. It doesn't help, and sometimes the over-enthusiast for Israel doesn't help their own church minister because they're trying to hold a whole congregation together. Some people like to be on the fringe, and they like the fact, they like that status, they like almost the notoriety of that. Personally, it's not where I want to be. I want to see my fellow Christians having a better understanding, a fuller understanding of Israel in its context. And I'm sad and sorry to see that that's not there, and it's harder. And it's nice to have a nice, I meet a lot of Jewish people, and it's lovely, and they're very thankful, and so on and so forth. But actually, my responsibility, I think, is to my own kind to help them, and it might go unnoticed behind the scenes. But everyone I can change there will make a bigger difference than just being good friends, you and I, which would happen, I think, because that's how I am.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. What would you say to my Jewish friends and colleagues that say this?
I first say, I completely understand, because I've been in those circles too, and actually, even though it might come as a surprise, I've been in those circles and felt a stranger to that kind of conversation, because my coming to a view that can be considered pro-Israel was not founded in biblical or theological justifications. And that might be quite unique in the sense that I saw the just simple historical validity of the claims of the Bible being completely undermined, and the Jewish people being victims of that, and seeing the relationship that I have as a Christian that relies on that historical truth to just make sense of historical Christianity, regardless of any eschatological or end-time idea. But I think also, I would say to them, it's not the priority. And what I mean by that is we have such a difficult time, first of all, understanding how Christianity has been obscured by anti-Semitism for centuries, that it's not productive to any conversation to start at the place of the end. Eschatology as a feature of Christian theology, systematic Christian theology, is one feature, and it is an important feature, but it can obscure your present day relationship with other people. It comes down to having that well-rounded, grounded understanding of Israel and what our relationship to is as Christians, independent of any end-time events or schedule. And that is possible, and I think that's more helpful. And it does come down a little bit to how we view our personal relationship with the Jewish people. There are some who will only ever quote the verse, "If you bless Israel, you'll be blessed." And that's okay because it's in the Bible, but it's a transactional relationship, that it's using you as a means to get to some sort of end-time blessing, whether that's present wealth or future blessing. And that is deeply troubling, because it's using the Jewish people as a means to an end, when the Bible speaks so clearly in the New Testament parables that Jesus taught, speaks so clearly about the love that one should have towards the person in front of you, and sort of an intimacy of kindness and service to those around you in your immediate environment. And indeed, this is what the parable of the Good Samaritan is all about. Jesus did not justify the good service of the Samaritan to the stranger by virtue of what blessing he would get in return. He did it, as Jay was saying, because it's the right thing. Right. And understanding why it's right is far more than just looking at what the end time says. And I think it can be difficult because you then alienate your Christian base and your Christian constituency from engaging with the conversation about Israel, because they see a sort of obsession with one particular aspect of theology, which is not maybe, and I don't know whether this is good or bad, but is not the focus of evangelicalism today. Yes. And we have such a task of educating our Christian peers, first of all, about Israel, biblically and historically, that we should be careful about where our conversations take us and whether that's helpful or unhelpful.
Mm-hmm.
What's the atmosphere like in churches today across the UK with regard to Israel? What are your feelings about that?
It's a mixture. Some will tour Israel. It does depend which tour companies they go with. I mean, there are some big tour companies that take out big tours that have an advocacy arm for the Palestinian cause. There are some which are targeting, certainly the Church of England, the bishops and the dioceses, to take them out on a particular one-sided tour. I try and, but if they've been to Israel or they're going to Israel, we try and attend some of the Christian festivals, a bit like sort of Christian Glastonbury, but not quite, or Edinburgh Fringe or something. And there's quite large grouping of Christian young people and families that would go to these various ones, and we'd have a stall there and all comers would come through. When you can get to speak to them individually, they're quite open. Some that have been, I've been there, and there's something ticking away, but it's not really explained much about in their by their church minister. It's a subject which tends to be controversial, so it's left to one side, perhaps. So they're getting it in other ways than the normal sort of teaching. And then there are others that have bought into or got involved in the social justice campaigning, perhaps not fully thought through. And I think the more you can avoid the polarisation, in some respects both ways, and see the broader picture and say, well, look, we've got a lot to learn here. There may be a few things we might be able to do, but mostly, it's to be a little bit more cautious. I
think it can sometimes actually be other ideologies which sometimes overtake their religion. I didn't go to a Jewish school, and the school reverend was close to being like a Marxist and deeply hostile to Israel.
Whereas 20 years ago they might not have been, but it's changed. But yes,
in retrospect, But just the very word saying a Marxist means that there's competing ideologies here.
Absolutely. I think you can look at the sort of the extremes on both sides, and you'll get a sort of minority of churches that are very openly pro-Israel, and to the extreme where they might even have Israel flags in the church and maybe sing worship songs in Hebrew, and sort of that extreme. But that's not the broad spread of modern evangelicalism, and neither is, I think, a sort of deep hostility to Israel. I don't think I wouldn't want to say that there is a deep conscious hostility to the Jewish people that exists within most churches. I would say, in a very English way, it's sort of polite indifference and hostile indifference, but the one thing that unites most is an indifference, and that comes partly because of an ignorance, and partly because we generally have, whether you're Baptist, Anglican, Catholic, although to varying degrees, church is conformed to the doctrinal positions of the pastor and ultimately what he preaches on a Sunday. And if he preaches regularly only from the New Testament and references the Old Testament only occasionally to support his view from the New, then people aren't going to be talking about Israel a lot. Israel isn't going to feature. I think what you said interesting about the ideologies is absolutely key, because you can see even in modern evangelical circles that young people are very sort of becoming attached to. There's often that underlying influence of that social justice attitude, or what we would sometimes refer to as liberation theology, which takes a political view about what it means to be oppressed and marginalised, and certain ideologies about power structures, and then decides to view their reading of the Bible through that lens, rather than having their politics informed by what the text says and how the text interprets itself. And that's a real danger. And it's a danger, but I also understand its power, because if you were to put in front of a young Christian whose experience of Christian Zionism has been one of, it's for the old people, it's for my grandparents, and they're a little bit obsessed by it, I'm a bit uncomfortable, and you put some of the difficult policy realities that exist in Israel and the status quo of hardship, that does exist for Palestinians, and but don't show the other side, then you are going to be moved in that way, and you're going to find that place within your faith to justify the sort of political solutions that are put in front of you. And so that is unfortunately a reality. But I think we need to sort of come to a wider acknowledgement that the partisanship that exists on both sides is not the whole picture, and we can find a place for biblical concern of justice without that being a justice defined by its reaction to Christian Zionism, false views of what Christian Zionism is in history.
In terms of promoting the cause of Zionism in the UK, one of the, I think, unfortunate statistics that we're seeing recently is that religion in general, but Christianity specifically, is that it's declining in terms of the amount of British people that believe in it. And I think a religious society is very important and healthy. Do you think that trying to focus on Christian Zionism should be the priority in this country in terms of promoting Zionism, or do you think maybe it's better to argue it from more secular perspective? Do you think that, as in, I'm talking about where do you focus your resources? Do you think that there would be a very powerful? I mean, I think Christians are now a minority in this country, but do you think they are, they deserve a lot of effort because they could become a very sort of strong constituency within the Zionist tent in this country?
Well, my view is this, that we've got to, if we are seeking to, our remit is our written text ultimately, and Israel is part of the picture. It's not the only part of the picture, but it is a part of the picture. So if you're going to miss that out, you're going to miss out quite a lot. And I think, again, as we went back to the structural, it's like trying to do a puzzle sometimes, and you take some bits and you've got that and looks really good there, and you take something else and that looks good there, but no one goes right the way around the edge. Let's get the edge right first of all, let's get the structure, and then we can start to see where things fit, and people never do it. And it's not an easy thing to do. Possibly even top theologians won't attempt to do it until right at the very end because they specialised in this book or specialised in that. To actually give there's a few very good, but it takes a lot of digesting. And I don't think that's really taught well enough. So in terms of Christian Zionism, both terms, that term, unfortunately, has been caricatured quite a lot. And so it's quite a difficult one to get beyond. So if I say I'm a Christian friend of Israel, first of all, I'm a Christian. Next, I'm a friend. And it's of Israel, but what is Israel? Is it Israel in the Bible? Is it Israel in history? Is it Israel in current affairs? Okay, look at Israel today. Are we looking at the 80% that's the Jewish population? When there's 20% that are not, well, we're supportive of those, as long as people are not antagonistic towards Israel within that country, and many of them are not. I think the Christian voice within the land is not well heard, partly because the Arab population is largely Muslim, both within Israel and also certainly in the areas under the control of the Palestinian Authority. So those are the voices that Christians hear, and that's what they relate to. And they only need one or two, and there's some significant ones that are very articulate to explain their story, and we lost this and lost that. However, there are groups who are within Israel, Christian Aramaics, who I've got to know over a period of time, who are very grateful for to have the protection of Israel, and they've got their brothers and sisters in Lebanon and Syria that are suffering terrible persecution through being Christian, and here they've got the freedom to be and who they wish to be. And I think that voice needs to be heard much more. Israel is actually a country where those, and actually strange to say, even many within the Palestinian area are benefiting hugely from Israel being a democracy. They're seeing something different they might otherwise not in a more autocratic state within the region.
Jonathan?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think there is so much opportunity for education without delving into theology that is just pure fact that can engage people in terms of their values and their connection. I think the key one is when you look at the Arab-Israeli conflict and you think about the way Christians are treated in the broader Middle East, and then you look at Israel. Israel, it might sound romantic to say it, but it's true. It is an oasis for the Christian community in Israel. And it's the only country in the Middle East that, in sort of complete safety and security, express their faith and live out their faith in a way that is comfortable and accepted and protected under law. And that was one of the key lessons that I learned from a young age as a Christian, from my parents who were involved in supporting persecuted Christians in Egypt and other places. But I always understood that Israel was different in that regard. And it's kind of stepping back and from this wider picture and looking at how Israel fits within the wider Middle East, rather than just narrowing our focus down to the immediate context of Israel and the Palestinians, because it's never just been about Israel and the Palestinians, it's always been about a much larger reality. So I think first it's speaking about what the Christian experience in the land is, and then talking about the benefit of Israel as a nation in terms of its resilience and its story, because when you look at the Bible, it's remarkable to see that the people of Israel who experienced all these fantastic things in the land historically, and can trace their history back to the people that we read of in the Bible, and we no longer see the Amorites, we no longer see the people of the Bible. You think about the story of the Jewish people. It is a huge inspiration, and it makes history come alive, and it gives you an excitement about your faith, because you're not just seeing your faith in the abstract, you're seeing your faith in the real history-making reality that you can be a part of today. And unfortunately, there's a tradition, I think, and a habit within Christianity to spiritualize everything, and this often comes down to a certain theological position on Israel, where you replace Israel with the church, and therefore you spiritualize all of the promises to the Jewish people, all of the aspects about who they are and their relevance for us today. But if you avoid that, and I think that's the biblical thing to do, you sort of can experience the kind of renewed excitement of your faith. And that's so important for Christians to understand, that you can be excited about your faith. And understanding Israel and seeing the breadth of history of the Jewish people to now, and the fact that you can go and visit those places is a huge part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So final question, what do you think Christians can do, what's the best things that Christians can do to support Israel?
So I think for students on campus, I would say that most Christian young people grow up with little to no understanding about Israel, or an understanding that's informed very naturally by the media. But we shouldn't, and this is for Jewish students, shouldn't assume an hostility, and should position themselves to be open and embracing to Christians, to invite them to explore what it means to be Jewish, what is their connection to Israel on campus, and realize that there's kind of almost a blank canvas, I think, for the majority of Christians at universities to learn about Israel and learn about the Jewish people, and engaging a little bit more about the experience of Christians in the land of Israel, about the experience of the Aramean Christians and the persecution that Palestinian Christians, particularly evangelicals, suffer in areas A of the West Bank, can be a huge connection point to connect your values of what it means to be pro-Israel with Christians who can identify with the need for Christians to be open and practicing, have the freedom to practice their faith. So I think having that open engagement, because there's just, before you can even talk about Israel, you need to bridge that gap of understanding first. So I would encourage students and particularly Jewish students on campus to position themselves to proactively welcome Christians into a conversation, and ask them questions about how they understand Israel in the Bible, and provoke them to think more about the relevance that Israel can have to their faith today.
Yeah. Jacob, what do you think individual Christians can do?
Well, I think a lot of it is to seek to as far as possible gain an understanding, and to start somewhere on that journey, wherever that might be, and try very hard not to hold overly preconceived ideas, because being confident enough in their own faith to be able to explore and say, well, maybe there's some areas where we need to correct. Do a study on Israel in the Scripture, for example. Even in what we would call the New Testament, what's referred to as the New Testament, Israel is mentioned 70 times. Well, just have a look at those contexts. What did that mean? Look at actually the story. If you read Acts, which is the history really of the early church, Luke, Acts, the biography, and then on, and look at it in those perspectives and realise how much we have benefited from the fact that message has come through to us as Gentiles. So a lot of it's actually trying to give time to engage properly on the subject and see the breadth of the subject. Yeah. Seeing Israel in context is absolutely key. Whether the context of the region, if you too focus in fact, it was a parable that Jesus used about straining a gnat and swallowing a camel. And I think that is quite apt as far as Israel is concerned. People can focus in on it because it's democracy, you've got access, you've got news, you've got media, but there's the whole Middle East there. What are they swallowing when they're just focusing on one little part?
Yes.
That's the problem. And I've personally have found it hugely rewarding to understanding what I actually myself believe, and it enhances it every I would say virtually every day. It's a tremendous privilege for me personally, and I think you have to engage with it. You have to look at where did the church go wrong, and accept that, and say, well, let's see what we can do today. I think we've gone in the wrong direction. Actually, we need to turn around and go positively in the right direction. Yeah. And that's certainly what I see the organisation Christian Friends of Israel seeking to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's been a privilege to have you both on and to learn more about Christianity and Zionism. And it's been really eye-opening, so thank you very much for coming on. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
To stay up to date with JTV content, click subscribe here if you're on YouTube and hit the alarm bell. And if you're on Facebook, hit the like button, and under following, click see first. If you enjoy watching JTV content and want to help us continue to grow, please consider making a donation to us by clicking here.